So it's a beautiful, cool fall day here in Idaho, and I am actually going to do this video from the comfort of my nice warm greenhouse that my husband Tom built for me this summer. And just kind of give you a little look-see here. There's still some of my plants. See the beautiful Idaho blue sky. You can see we've sort of set up a little living area out here so we can hang out, be in the sunshine even on cool or cold days. And that'll be here this winter. And we're looking forward to enjoying our greenhouse, not just in the spring and summer, but also during the winter. So thankful to the Lord for having such a talented, gifted, and kind, loving husband who has the ability and the inclination to make such things for me. So today I want to sort of get started on the Matthew 24 Olivet discourse. We're going to do a little Bible study. And one of the ways that I like to do a Bible study is using I think it's a good Bible study technique, a good Bible study method, and that is trying to get into the heads of the people who were living when Jesus originally spoke these words. So in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, there's a lot of what we know of as end time passages that have to do with the coming of the Lord and the abomination of desolation and the fig tree generation. All of those passages are in Matthew chapter 24, and we look at them and we go, well, this is eschatology. This has to do with end times. But when the disciples got this little message from Jesus, what was in the back of their minds? What were they thinking? And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at what was going on inside the heads of the apostles when Jesus told them the story of the coming kingdom. So let's take a look at Matthew 24. We'll just start with verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age?" These are the questions that the apostles were asking, that Jesus' disciples wanted to know. When will the temple be destroyed? Okay, when will this be? That's the question that has to do with when will the temple be destroyed. What'll be the sign of your coming? And I've talked about this on many occasions. It's very few people actually know what the sign of Jesus' coming is, but he was very plain about it in Matthew 24, verse 30. Jesus spells out what the sign of his coming is. And not going to look at that today, but I encourage you to go and read that verse, and you will know what the sign of Jesus' coming is. Jesus was very plain about this, very, very clear. The third question the disciples wanted to know was, what would be the close of the age? So there's questions here about, what is the age? What is, the close of the age? Basically, what they wanted to know was, when is this present age going to end that they were living in? And when is the millennial age, or when is the kingdom going to come? That was the big question. They wanted to know, when was the temple going to be destroyed? What was that all about? Was there going to be a sign that preceded his arrival, his parousia? Remember, that word coming isn't just, somebody coming. It's about the arrival of a king or a potentate who's about ready to take charge and ready to take control. So it's not simply someone coming or going. It's about an arrival of someone very important. I've talked about that word parousia on many different occasions, and I invite you to go to the Strong's Concordance online and look it up so you'll know what that word means. There are various Greek words that are translated as coming, but when you see this word parousia, this has to do with Jesus' arrival, has to do with the day of the Lord, it has to do with him ushering in the kingdom of God. The questions: when is the temple going to be destroyed? Is there a sign associated with your arrival as king? And when is the close of the age? And basically, when is the beginning of the kingdom age? So those were the big questions that the disciples had, and Jesus is going to answer them. He's only going to indirectly answer the question about when will the temple be destroyed. He will answer it indirectly. And I think the indirect there has to do with the prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. So one of the difficulties that people have when interpreting Bible passages or just reading them, what we tend to do is take how we understand the passage, how we understand what Jesus is saying from our perspective in time, and sort of apply it to the passage, rather than trying to get inside the head of, in this case, the disciples who were living at that time. How would they have thought about this? What was motivating them to ask those certain questions? Why did they want to know? Why was this important to them? What were the kind of answers that the disciples were maybe hoping for? What was their expectation? And what events may have just recently transpired that may have led them to believe that the kingdom was like right there at the door? So when I was studying this passage, I went back to some of the previous chapters of things that happened or that were leading up to the Olivet discourse. And there's a number of things, really important things, really big things that had to do with the coming kingdom that actually had happened to the disciples. Things that they had witnessed and things they'd heard Jesus say. And you have to remember, when the disciples took Jesus very literally, they were very literal in how they thought about the kingdom. They understood that the kingdom was going to be a literal kingdom, and I believe that it actually is going to be a literal earthly kingdom. It's going to be a kingdom that Christ sets up here on the earth. So there was this idea of a literal earthly kingdom, and the apostles believed that that was going to happen, that was going to come. And here's what they were looking for. This is what the disciples wanted. They wanted a position of authority and power in Jesus' coming kingdom. Now, this is something that we sort of gloss over or forget about, that part of their motivation for following Jesus was not just to get more spiritual. It was because they wanted to participate in this coming kingdom, the kingdom of the Messiah. They were rather ambitious. They wanted a position. And we see this throughout the Gospels. We see this in several places where it's spelled out really clearly for us. Particularly, we'll take a look at Matthew 20, verse 20. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to him with her sons, and kneeling before him, she asked him for something. And he said to her, "What do you want?" And she said to him, "Command that these 2 sons of mine may sit, one at your right hand and one at your left hand, in your kingdom." But Jesus answered, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" And they said to him, "We are able." And he said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard of it, they were indignant at the 2 brothers. And then Jesus went on to talk about how in his kingdom, it's not about who's on top, it's about who is the servant of all. And that to be on top, to have a position of authority, also means that you are going to take the lowest place. Let's look at a cross-reference for that in Mark 10. starting at verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said, "We are able." And then Jesus went again to say, "Well, it's not for me to say. I can't say one way or the other for you." And verse 41, and when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are supposed to rule over the Gentiles lord it over them, but it shall not be among you. Whoever would be greatest or whoever would be first must be the slave of all." So do you think that the disciples actually understood what Jesus was saying there? No, they didn't. They didn't have a clue. They didn't understand. They wanted a position in God's kingdom. They didn't know that it would come through death and through martyrdom and through suffering and through humiliation. That this is how people are qualified to have a position of authority in God's kingdom. The disciples were very ambitious, and they knew that Jesus was going to be the king. I mean, they had this conviction about who he was as a person, and they saw the power that he had over the wind and over the waves and over, he could multiply the food, he could heal the sick, and he even raised the dead. Okay, he raised Lazarus from the dead. He also raised a couple of other people from the dead. But the thing is that they knew that Jesus had this power. They knew he had authority. They understood finally at the very end that Jesus had come from God and that he was giving the disciples the words of God. But they had a really hard time grasping the idea that the kingdom wasn't coming like yesterday. And they thought it was going to be very, very close, and they wanted a position. And in fact, in John 14 verses 2 and 3, Jesus said to the disciples that in his Father's house there was a lot of room and that he was going to prepare a place for them. Now, in the Jewish thought of the time, in the Hebraic understanding, was that if you had a position, you had a place. If you don't have a position, you don't have a place. Okay, if you are the steward of the master and you do well, you have a place in the home. You have a place, a position. You have a position and a place. But if you don't do well with your stewardship, you're going to be kicked out of your stewardship, which means you also lose your place in the home. So the idea of position and place go together. And Jesus said that in my Father's house there's a lot of room. Jesus is not going to add room to his Father's house, but he is going to prepare positions of authority, positions of stewardship for the apostles. And that is really what they wanted. They had no concept about being the bride of Christ, or, the idea that Jesus was going to come for them like a groom comes for the bride and, prepares a home or an add-on unto the Father's house. What Jesus already had said was there's lots of room, and I'm going to go to my Father's house, not to add on to his house, but to create positions so that there's a place and a position of authority and stewardship for you there. So the disciples were wanting to have a position of authority in the coming kingdom. That's what they were hoping for. And like I said earlier, Jesus had done all these miracles, and he seemed like the one that they were to follow, the one who would be the Messiah. So when it comes to the idea of the temple being destroyed, Jesus had done several things that may have led the disciples to believe or to understand that Jesus was going to do away with that present temple. There were 2 times when Jesus threw out the money changers in the temple. The first time was at the beginning of his ministry, which was recorded in, I think it's John chapter 2. And then at the end of his ministry, after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, again, Jesus went into the temple and threw out the money changers. He did it 2 times. Now, the first time Jesus did that, his disciples were there. And John chapter 2, starting with verse 13, says the Passover, the Jews, was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He saw the animals and money changers and so on, and he made a whip and he cast them out of the temple. And then the Jews asked him, "What sign have you to show us for doing this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body, but the Jews who were listening to him, and even the disciples who were listening to him, thought that Jesus might be tearing down the temple, that he would tear it down and that he would have the ability to build a new temple in 3 days. Okay, the disciples were very literal in their understanding of the temple. Jesus was speaking metaphorically of the temple of his body and comparing it to the temple that was in existence, the actual brick and mortar temple. And Jesus was always speaking on a plane or on a level where his disciples were going, what? Don't understand this. Can you explain the parable to us? And here it says, in verse 21, it says, he spoke of the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, the disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture, the word that Jesus had spoken. So it wasn't until after Jesus rose from the dead, after 3 days and 3 nights in the, belly of the earth, that the disciples went, oh, I think he was talking about his body. He wasn't talking about the literal temple. Although prior to Jesus' resurrection, that thought may still have been in their mind that this temple was going to be destroyed and in 3 days it would be raised up again. So the idea of the destruction of that present temple was something that had already been, was a seed that had already been planted in their minds. And then at the close of Jesus' ministry, after the triumphal entry, which we're going to talk about as well, after Jesus rode into Jerusalem, he again goes into the temple with the money changers, and he again drives out the people who are selling animals and changing money. And we read about that in Luke chapter 19, verses 45 and 46, Matthew 21, verses 12 to 17, Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 19. Those are 3 passages talk about Jesus cleansing the temple, so-called cleansing the temple. He didn't actually cleanse it. It needed to be destroyed. It was beyond repair. But the disciples were thinking about this. Jesus had rode into Jerusalem. People were crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David. He's again going into the temple and, acting like he's the boss there, which he is. And they're thinking about this. And then when Jesus says that this temple is going to be destroyed, there won't be one stone left on another, they're thinking, this sounds good. You've said that this was going to happen. And we know that there is another temple that's prophesied to be built during the kingdom, which is the temple that's we read about in Ezekiel. In some ways, the disciples are cool with the idea. They're fine with the idea of the temple being destroyed, even though they're big, beautiful, ornately, carved stones, and they're huge, and everything is magnificent. If they read the book of Ezekiel, they would know that Ezekiel's temple is way more awesome than what the second temple was, even though it was embellished by Herod. So this idea of the destruction of the temple was not a foreign concept for the disciples. This is where we kind of got to get into the heads of the disciples. What were they thinking? What were they anticipating would happen before the literal establishment of the kingdom? And then they were hoping they would get a position in that kingdom, and they were believing that Jesus was going to rule in that kingdom. What they didn't understand was that Jesus has two different ministries. His first ministry at his first coming was to raise up the apostles, these 12 men, and to die for the sins of the world and rise from the dead. That was the first aspect of Jesus' ministry. He has a second coming ministry. The second part of his ministry, which is also part of that 70th week of Daniel, is when he delivers the remnant of Israel into the wilderness at the time of the abomination of desolation, and finally his glorious return after 1,260 days or 3.5 years. Okay, the disciples didn't understand. Jesus' ministry would be divided into two parts of 3.5 years each, which makes up that 70th week of Daniel. Later in the Olivet discourse, when Jesus makes reference to the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, let the reader understand this is something that was talked about in Daniel. Now, if we go back to Daniel chapter 9, this is where we're going to get an indirect reference to the destruction of the temple. We'll start with verse 25 of Daniel 9. Know therefore and understand that from going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem until the coming of an anointed one, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So from the time the decree goes out to rebuild the city of Jerusalem until Messiah, there would be 69 weeks of years. Okay, and this is a passage again that people do not look at. They don't understand that there would be a full 69 weeks of years before the Messiah would come. Okay, which meant that the Messiah would come at the beginning of the 70th week. Okay, the full 69 weeks of years, and when we're talking weeks of years, we're talking sabbatical years again. And a sabbatical year starts in the fall with the Feast of Trumpets, and it goes until the following year in the fall, in the 7th month. Okay, this is how the sabbatical years work. They're tied to the agricultural calendar of Israel, which begins in the fall with the planting of the barley and the wheat. Okay, that's when that would start. Those crops would be planted in the fall. From the going forth of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the coming of the anointed one, there'll be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And by the way, that 7-week interval is the 49 years, which would make the following year the Jubilee year. Verse 26, after the 62 weeks, okay, so after the full 69 weeks of years, after that, sometime, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. And we know that that's Jesus. He's the Messiah, the anointed one, or Messiah. And he was anointed at his baptism when he was anointed with the Holy Spirit. Okay, he wasn't anointed at the triumphal entry. That was not an anointing, but he was anointed at the beginning of his 3.5-year ministry. After the 62 weeks, sometime after that, the anointed one would be cut off and have nothing, and a people of a prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, and desolations are decreed. So once the anointed one is cut off, excommunicated, there's going to be a people of a prince, not the people of the prince. It's the indefinite article in the Hebrew, that there was going to be a group of people under another prince who would come in and destroy the city and the sanctuary. It's part of the prophecy of Daniel. And then when you get to verse 27, we're going back to the Messiah, the prince again. And he, that will be Jesus, will make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and offering to cease. Okay. In the midst of the week, he will cause the offering and sacrifice to cease, and that is through his death on the cross. Okay, so Daniel prophesied the coming destruction, the destruction of the rebuilt or second temple. This was actually prophesied that would happen. The disciples probably were familiar with that passage, that was something that was coming. Now, they didn't know how to fit it into their kingdom theology or their eschatology, but we have a whole lot more information now, so we actually know more about how all that works. But the cleansing of the temple was something that they wouldn't have seen as being a bad thing. They would have seen it as part of the whole ushering in of the kingdom. That would be something that would have to take place. Jesus didn't specifically answer when this temple would be destroyed, but he did make a reference to Daniel, and we know that this is in reference to Daniel chapter 9. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is to help you to think outside of the box here, to understanding what it was that the disciples were looking for, the motivation for the questions that they were asking. Was it a surprise for them that Jesus would say that the temple would be destroyed? No, it was actually, it's prophesied in Daniel that would happen. And Jesus had already said, destroy this temple, 3 days I'll raise it up. And they didn't know that he was talking about his body, not until afterward. And he had already gone into the temple to kick out the money changers and to upbraid the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests. I mean, he read them the riot act. You can read that in Matthew chapter 23. And so they're looking at all this and they're going, well, okay, that looks to be a part of what will happen before you set up your kingdom. So, okay, the next question they ask then, is there a sign for this? Is there something you're going to do that's going to prove to the whole world that you're about to set up your kingdom? And yes, there is a sign. We're going to look at that in another video. And I've mentioned it here. It's actually in verse 30. But the next question they asked was, when is the close of the age? Okay, when is this going to happen? Now, in their minds, the Daniel 9 prophecy, Daniel 9:27, and they understood that they were actually in the 70th week of Daniel. They had been expecting the arrival of the Messiah after the 69th week, in the 70th week. Okay, after 69 comes 70. At the close of the 69th week, which would be the beginning of the 70th week, they were expecting the Messiah to come, and sure enough, he did. He did come then, exactly when the Jews were expecting him. And I've talked about this on so many videos. You can look at my video series, The Messiah and Daniel, or the 70th week of Daniel playlist. I've talked about this on numerous occasions, so I'm not going to detail it. If you're interested, please look at some of the videos in those playlists. But they thought they were in the 70th week, about 3.5 years, almost 3.5 years into this 70th week. And they may have been wondering, do we have to be here for the rest of the 3.5 years when you usher in the kingdom at the end of the 70th week? Is this happening faster than we thought? Is there something else that needs to happen? Because it looks like you're pretty much, you've got this in the bag. And why would they think that? It's because of the triumphal entry. They had just watched Jesus be lauded and praised and worshiped and hosanna'd just like a few days before. And they're like, okay, are we there yet? Are we there? Is the kingdom about to come in? And they were so anxious to get this ball rolling. And as I'm saying this, I'm going, yeah, this is just the feeling that we have too, when it comes to the rapture of believers. Can we just get this thing going? But for the disciples, they thought that they might actually be nearer to the coming kingdom, to the close of the age, than they had originally anticipated. Like, how much more needs to happen? Do we really need this other 3.5 years of the 70th week in order for you to usher in your kingdom? So, the end of the 70th week of Daniel, that will be the 10th Jubilee. Jesus is going to return. His second coming is going to usher in a Jubilee year. Now, God has been preparing for the end of the age since the beginning, since the dawn of creation. He set all the stars in space so that when it came time for Jesus to be born, the Bethlehem star would appear. He set all these stars in motion so that when the time came for the sign of Revelation 12 to appear in the starry heavens, it would be there. All the elements, all the planets, all the stars, the sun and moon would be in perfect alignment for that. He knows the end from the beginning, and because he knows the end, he goes back. He goes back in time and sets things in motion so that everything is finally ready at the end. So the disciples were wondering, do we have another 3.5 years to go? I'm sure they were wondering that. They didn't factor in something that Jesus had been talking to them about, that he'd have to die, that he'd have to suffer and be rejected, excommunicated, as Daniel said, cut off. That word, that the Messiah would be cut off, has to do with excommunication. Excommunication, being put out of the community, cut off from the people. And because he was rejected by the chief priests and scribes, that would usher in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the city and the sanctuary. And that happened in 70 AD. So the prophet Daniel talked about that. But when we get into the 70th week, this is actually the most important week of all of the weeks, because this is the week of the Messiah. This is Messiah's week. This is his week when he confirmed the covenant with many through his blood, through his death on the cross. And when he died, he put to rest the offerings and the sacrifices. Okay, and that brought that first half of Daniel's 70th week to rest. It brought it to an end. That took place, and then there is this grand pause between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. And his second coming will actually start with his arrival on the Mount of Olives to deliver the remnant into the wilderness for 1,260 days. The 70th week is about Jesus' dealings with the nation of Israel. And he'll come to the Mount of Olives just like he left after his first coming. He's going to come back to the Mount of Olives, split that mountain in two, and lead the remnant into the wilderness, where they're going to be kept safe for 3.5 years, 1,260 days, until he comes back to usher in the kingdom. So the 70th week is about the two different ministries that Jesus had with the nation of Israel. Well, he had, past tense, the first half of the 70th week is his first coming. And the last half of Daniel's 70th week will begin when he ushers the remnant into the wilderness. It's during the end times. So the putting an end to sacrifice and offerings has to do with Jesus' first coming. The abomination of desolation, when the man of sin takes his seat in the temple of God, that will be the same day as the departure of the remnant into the wilderness, the apostasia of the remnant into the wilderness. So this is basically the background story, as I see it anyway, to Matthew 24, to the Olivet Discourse. I'm trying to set a stage for what Jesus is going to be talking about, and how it's very possible and most likely that the disciples did not understand a single word that Jesus was saying at the time. The other thing that I want to mention, that I'll probably mention in the next video, follow-up video, when we're talking about things that had happened that the disciples had been a part of, it was part of their experience, that caused them to think that the kingdom of God was like going to be immediately ushered in, was the transfiguration and what Jesus said just prior to the transfiguration. But we'll talk about that in the next video. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Hope you'll get a copy of my book, Convergence, and take a look at the timeline at endtimetimeline.online. There's a link for that. I think you'll be blown away and impressed by this beautiful presentation that our brother Reiner has put together for us. We'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.